Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm currently sort of battling COVID, but I really just needed to be here and to have this conversation with you about, a topic that I find so important. And just to engage in sort of a critical conversation about race, philanthropy, and imperialism. I'm trying my best to sort of make this as accessible as possible. So I'm not going to use sort of the big, complex academic language that you tend to see in sort of conversations around imperialism and race. I'm also going to try my best to give a sort of brief introduction to just the history of race, how race came to be, and how we can understand sort of race as a feature of all sort of the sort of organization of society. I think it's so fundamentally important when we have conversations about the fundraising sort of community, when we have conversations about philanthropy, when we have conversations about aid, to not just focus internally on the sort of dynamics of the aid sector, the experience of racism that we have within the context of the UK, but actually look further outwards at racism as a global system, and the use of imperialism as a sort of analysis of this is fundamentally important to understanding racism beyond our borders. Because the racism that exists through these mechanisms of imperialism is racism nonetheless. It's racism that is inherently potent, racism that's inherently sort of violent, but very often we don't necessarily have the language for it. I'm also going to try and make some interventions to some of the ways that we talk about sort of that specific type of philanthropic imperialism, and move us back to understanding and analyzing these complex structures, these systems of economic control, these systems of aid sort of like violence, as inherently important to how we shift and turn the tide within philanthropy, within aid, within the sort of third sector, especially if we want to claim to be anti-racist, right? It's not just good enough to talk about racism within the context of the UK, as potent as it is here. It's important to think about the global structures of racism, what maintains racism, the racism that's not as easily identifiable. Right, so let me get this slide started. So just a kind of introduction to the themes that we're going to be looking at today. I'm going to give a sort of brief genealogy of race and empire. So this is more of just a quick historical analysis of how race comes to being and how empire is embedded within that construction of race. Then we'll look at the features of imperialism and some examples of imperialism. We'll then talk through neo-imperialism and neocolonialism. We'll then think through imperialism and aid and what this can look like. And then some hopes, right? Some efforts, some advice in combating imperialism within the aid sector, and just being able to identify, I think, is already a really big sort of push forward in the way we start to understand imperialism in the aid sector. So how did we become racialized subjects? This is something that I'm fundamentally interested in as a scholar of race. I'm thinking through race all the time. I'm talking about race all the time. I'm trying to understand how race comes about, why race is so important to us. And in my sort of analysis of race, there are a few things that I think I found out that I want to be clarified, things that haven't necessarily reached the public consciousness, things that people sort of know about, but sometimes misapply, misunderstand. So race was a term originally used to distinguish between family members. It then sort of was extrapolated, it shifted, it changed in its meaning to categorize distinct regional groups. But actually the most significant transformation of race as we know it, not just as a terminology, but as an organizational structure, and perhaps what grounds the type of racialism that constructs how we think about society today, came about through the sort of shifting in society into one of sort of feudalism to one of a sort of racial capitalist social order. So race actually comes to being, if we analyze race, through the need to categorize and distinctly categorize different forms of labor. And during this time, race became a tool that was used by the ruling class elite to distinguish and demarcate particular types of bodies for particular types of labors. But also the sort of advent of this project of race also created the project of nationalism in the context of the English. It created a sort of identity politic that co-conscripted sort of working class people who had very little in terms of cultural, social, or even political allegiances to the ruling class, and actually gave them a project of whiteness to buy into, gave them a project of nationalism to buy into. So race is actually quite an important tool, right? Race in the construction of whiteness specifically is an important tool for the mystification of the relationships between people. And in the context of sort of Britain, this national identity not only sort of constructed the grounds for things like slavery, but also the colonization of Africa and the creation of the British Empire. So, race and empire, and this is something I'm fundamentally interested in. So when we talk about race, you will tend to find people say, race is a social construct, but they never really go further to actually, unpack what that means. What does it mean for it to be a social construct? And I've been having some great conversations and reading the works of this fantastic scholar, Alana Lentin, whose work I can't recommend enough, who forces us to push past this language of social constructs and to think about race more as a technology of power that arises through the need to consolidate power and further the project of acquisition, exploitation, and colonialism. So as previously described, when we think through the way race comes about through this need to sort through labor, to sort of identify and create these categories of human and subhuman, to identify particular types of bodies that are more valuable to particular types of labor, and also mystify everyone from the reality of our social relations, we need to understand this as a technology, as something that comes about through intelligent sort of, architects who are designing this system and designing the system to last. Now, the project of empire, thus, is inseparable from the creation of racialism. Whiteness comes about through the need not only justify the actions of colonization and slavery through the logics of white supremacy and dominance, but also to consolidate power, right? To get people who have nothing in common to buy into a project of power, and that project being whiteness. Now, through the history of the world, there's been resistance to empire. However, the resistances have also led to the transformation and the operation mechanisms of race and empire. So the way that we maybe understood racism, the way that we understood racialism, and the way we understood colonialism and imperialism has lasted, but transforms as society transforms. So what is so fundamentally important for me in this talk is to sort of open our eyes to how throughout history, especially when we think through the aid sector, when we think through from missionaries till now, there's been particular transformations. There's been transformations in language. There's been transformations in these sort of economical and political systems of empire. But nevertheless, empire resists, empire maintains. And very often the aid sector, from missionaryism to now, what we may even call philanthropy, has always served in the context of the global South as a tool for mystifying what is a violent imperialism through language such as sort of like helping other people, through languages of saviorism, through languages of, aid, through languages of interventionism. All of these things are a violent form of imperialism that we're very often just unaware of, right? And we're unaware of these things because when we look at the state of the global South, when we see devastation, when we see poverty, when we see climate crisis, of course we want to help. Of course we want to donate money. Of course we want to send UN peacekeepers. Of course we want to be involved in what we think is an important issue of sometimes complex politics. But that interventionism, when it comes from the global North, never comes out of the goodness of their hearts, right? The aid that we see happen in places like Africa never comes out of a sort of paternalistic wanting to do good. The paternalism is actually a crude paternalism of empire, a crude paternalism of imperialism. So I put this up last night because I was thinking through my main sort of gripes with how we think through these systems and of power, these systems of change. And it's a sort of critique I have for the language of privilege, but it sort of applies here quite well too, right? So when we use the language of things like privilege, the languages of white saviorism, what we do is, although well-meaning as it is, right, to point out someone like Ed Sheeran and Stacey Dooley going into African countries, the gap year people going to these African countries, taking pictures of poor African children, the sort of violence of that positioning, of a physical representation, a photographic representation of this sort of white saviorism. But this isn't just a white saviorism. This isn't just an individualistic sort of misappropriation of what is aid, right? This is imperialism. And when we use the language of white saviorism, we actually take away that power, we take away that complexity, we take away what has been theorized to be forms of imperialism. And I'm going to talk about the different forms of imperialism in a bit, but I want us to push beyond this notion of white saviorism and start to use the potent language of imperialism, of colonialism, of neocolonialism, colonialism, to talk about the way these images evoke a particular meaning for us, to talk about the ways in which a sector isn't just sending celebrities to take pictures with kids, actually is creating these sort of back channels of political instability, creating these crises of disposability and dependency that doesn't seek to create a betterment of the social conditions for people who are in the global south, but actually maintains this sort of dependence relationship between the global south and the global north, that dependent relationship being one of absolute exploitation and extraction, right? But mystified through this language, mystified through these imageries. We need to be as angry about the political systems as we are about Stacey Dooley taking pictures with little black kids in Africa. So how do we define imperialism and coloniality? Two really important terms that I want us to critically engage in, right? I think we're often, when you're sort of a layperson, when you're not someone within the academic field, some people can feel nervous or anxious about using this terminology. But it's important for us to actually reclaim this terminology because they mean particular things. They often describe what we're saying in the best possible way, without cutting corners, without trying to sort of appease people's feelings. They speak to the conditions that we need to speak to, that we need to be sort of aware of. So first of all, imperialism. To define imperialism, we can go to sort of Lenin for this, who says that capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of much of the people of the world by a handful of advanced countries. Countries in the global north have this sort of stronghold on the global south for a reason. These things, again, like mentioned in my articulation of race, are by design. These are technologies of power. Now, coloniality, as defined by Walter Mignolo, is the darker side of Western modernity. It's a complex matrix of power that has been created and controlled by Western men and institutions from the Renaissance periods until now. The project of modernity, as Mignolo so wonderfully describes in some of his works, needs to be understood as a project that interrupted the natural development of the global south, right? It created a crisis, it created a rupture. It created a rupture because the period of colonization, the periods of slavery, what happened during those times was an absolute theft of resources, of knowledges, of, power, of complexity, of so much culture. And that creates this interruption. The Western world as we know it, the comforts that we experience by virtue of being in places like Britain, the Americas, the Australias, much of Europe, would not exist and could not exist had we not interrupted the development of places in Africa, places in India, places like India, places all over the world that are now viewed as sort of the developing, the third world, the global south, countries that are in a system of absolute exploitation and who are seeing the sorts of consequences of this exploitation daily. Our power, our comfort, our ability to access the things that we have to access in the West is an absolute consequence of the devastation that happens in the global south. And in fact, the potency of our sort of images, the potency of our visibility within the context of the global north often seeks to actually mystify and completely erase the violent racism that people in the global south experience. Something I always say is that within our anti-racism, we have to be internationalists. And we have to be internationalists because we often think that our closeness to the proximity of whiteness and our experiences of these sort of daily interactions of racism is the most concentrated effects of racism. But actually, the most concentrated, the most potent, the most violent forms of racism are experienced by those who have very little contact with white people at all, very little contact with whiteness as a direct force, but they feel whiteness in its colonial structure. They feel whiteness in its capitalistic structure. They feel the sort of oppression of whiteness far greater than any of us who have a closer proximity to whiteness could ever actually witness. Now, so features and types of imperialism actually too. So we have cultural imperialism, and cultural imperialism is something that I'm so fundamentally interested in. And I'm interested in it because very often you hear people talk about cultural appropriation, and cultural appropriation has become this somewhat of this sort of watered down dance that people do, this sort of outpour of rage that we have when we see images. imagery, symbols, hairstyles, things that we deem cultural practices being sort of worn by white people. But cultural imperialism is far more crude, and again, why I sort of beg for us to return to its original language. Cultural imperialism is the destruction of cultures using the logics of capitalism, using the logics of colonialism. It's more than just, you know, white girls wearing bindis at festivals. It's about the entire industry that creates a sort of cultural deficit through the sort of acts of colonialism, through the destruction of cultures. When we talk about appropriation, we have to talk about the eradication of of cultures through the sort of commodification and selling and misappropriating of particular cultural symbols, of cultural sort of languages, of foods, of, you know, a whole mass of people beyond the performance of sort of like white individualistic sort of, you know, uses of artifacts. We need to think about this as a global system. We need to think about this as an infiltration that often destroys a nation, that destroys nations, that destroys histories, that destroys knowledges. That's the type of imperialism. That's the type of cultural appropriation that we need to so much more sort of be focused on, you know. Now, philanthropic imperialism, or Western saviorism, or white saviorism, the various language we used to talk about this, is very, very, very important. It's so important because, as I mentioned previously, the context through which we saw missionaries sort of going to Africa, being part of this project of colonization and mystifying colonization through this language of do-gooderism, still lasts today. There are very few industries, there are very few organizations that work in the global south that, one, do not work actively alongside sort of global political powers to destabilize nations. There are very few philanthropic people, for example, Bill Gates with his, you know, almost eugenicist rhetoric around the context of Africa and using this eco-fascist logic of population control as the driver for saving the world, essentially. These are philanthropic imperialisms, right? These are dog whistles. And then we have the project of colonization, probably the largest imperialistic project that we can think of, that is, you know, 400 years old and is continuously lasting even today. Militarization and war, a fundamental sort of analysis when we talk about not just the aid sector, but also the project of imperialism, often working through these, you know, militarized sort of forces, how often aid serves as a backdrop for attempted militarizations and war, especially a tactic used by places like the US. We have to talk about settler colonization. We have to talk about the theft of land. We have to talk about the theft of land. We have to talk about the destabilization of nations. We have to talk about the loss of land, the loss of culture, the loss of home for so many people who are displaced through the project of settler colonialism. We can think about this in regards to the entire project of America being one of settler colonization, America and Canada. We can talk about epistemicide as well as a feature of imperialism. Epistemicide being the destruction of knowledge, the destruction of indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, the destruction of text, the destruction of analysis, the destruction of critiques, all which serve this idea mentioned earlier about the sort of renaissance of Western modernity, this idea that the West has the most superior knowledge. All of these features interplay, and these are all the projects of imperialism. So imperialism is something that is ongoing, something that is fundamentally important to anyone who cares about the global south to have as part of their analysis, as part of their thought process when they're thinking through what happens in the global south. And neo-imperialism and neocolonization, also very important sort of languages that we need to have in our wheelhouse when we think through the project of imperialism. So the essence of colonialism is that the state, which is subject to its, in theory, independent, let me start that again. In essence, neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to its, in theory, independence and has all the outwards trappings of international sovereignty, but in reality, it's an economic system, and it's, I'm reading this all sort of wrong, so I'm going to try it one last time. Essentially, neocolonialism is an outward image of statehood, which in theory, in places like Ghana, in places like Nigeria, in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, gives this idea that they have an international sovereignty, that they have an international power, that they have a democratic system. But in reality, it's an economic system and a political system that is completely manipulated from the outside. When we talk about the project of colonization ending, very often we think that the British just decided to leave. The French just decided to leave. These countries became independent. It was a joyful occasion, and now they run their own external, internal political affairs. But the trouble with that is that that's an absolute farcity. And actually what happened at the end of colonization was a transformation from the colonial state, which had this direct sort of rule or indirect rule by the sort of colonial powers, has now shifted to a sort of obscure rule. So not necessarily indirect rule, but the logics, the systems, the power, the sort of who's pulling the strings hasn't changed, but the way the strings have been pulled have changed. So we actually transformed into a system of neocolonization, not an end of colonization. And actually, Western donor aid very often is what has replaced this sort of direct controlling system and created these new strings that are being pulled. So Western donor aid is often used as a subsidy for foreign corporate involvement in places like Africa, despite dubious returns for the poorer citizenry in developing countries. Aid has historically been used as a sort of market exchange, as a tool of leverage, as a tool of control and power within former colonized countries. And that is something that is still going on. So any conversations about philanthropy that do not account for this absolute reality, that do not do the work of saying, what is the catch, right? We're offering this amount of money, we're offering this amount of resources. What is happening that we're not seeing, obviously? When we start to look more deeper, we find that there is almost always a contractual extraction happening there, one that is inherently exploitative. And this is why it's so important for me to continue to sort of open our eyes when we talk about aid, when we talk about philanthropy, when we talk about charity, to think through these sorts of transformed systems, to think through the way these sort of new languages of aid have served as tools for creating and recreating and very often reconstituting these inherently racist power dynamics, and actually serves the sort of project of white supremacy. So aid and missionary, sort of a more direct history here. So philanthropy and aid to the global south needs to be critically understood as having a history that is explicitly tied to the colonization of the global south. The history of Western paternalism through religious and economic philanthropy exists as part of the logics of white European supremacy that has often viewed the global south as cursed in some instances and requiring saving. So this has also often served as an ideological means by which Europe could claim its dominance, was the consequence of inferiority and impurity of the global south, especially the continent of Africa. What this then does is it does not understand the crisis of poverty and scarcity in the global south as historically and materially linked to extraction and exploitation of colonized and indigenous people, but rather it presents them as coincidences, as accidents, and more crudely, as sometimes punishment for types of sinhoods. Now, a lot of these wounds of these types of imperialistic actions using sort of aid and missionarism has never actually been mended. It's never been acknowledged. And there's been very little attempts by the aid sector to acknowledge this history and attempt to restore and repair these complex histories. So now finally, how do we then challenge this history? How do we, create a system of accountability, create a system of care within the aid sector? How do we, as committed anti-racists who do not only have a sort of narrow focus of anti-racism, but have an internationalist focus of anti-racism, what do we do? How do we hold sort of people's feet to the fire? How do we work within these systems ethically as well, right? How do we deal with those sort of contradictions, those tensions that we feel working for particular organizations? I'm not going to name any ones in particular that have a long sordid history, that have legacies of sort of problematic histories. But by being committed to the work of transforming the global south, we feel that we need to align to, right? Because part of changing the world also means building power. And very often the people that have the power are some of the most problematic institutions. The people that have the sort of feet on the ground are some of the most problematic institutions. So first of all, I think history is fundamentally important. And it's why I've sort of done a brief sort of history of not only race, but imperialism, colonialism, and also the sort of aid sector, specifically looking at a case study on missionaries. So we have to firstly recognize the history of missionaries through systems of accountability and critical reflection. Any sort of anti-racist organization that does not acknowledge its history, does not acknowledge its role, does not acknowledge its mistakes, is sort of bound to repeat its mistakes. Our second task, once we do this work of recognition, accountability, and critical reflection, is to repair the relationship with colonized people by allowing them to guide and lead our approaches. Very often when we sit within the context of the global north and exist within these sort of organizations, we assume we have the most knowledge. We assume that this work is not being done by anyone but us. The reality is there are people on the ground doing grassroots work. And very often when we come in with this sort of paternalism, we come in with this sort of we know the most act, what we do is we destabilize work that's been happening for years. We destabilize people who know their own context, who are working often with very little resources. We take the attention from them, and we often use misguided approaches to engaging with communities. We have to allow the people on the ground to lead us. We have to ensure that our work is grassroots led at every opportunity. It's also important to restore trust in the communities we serve through a commitment and investment in the centering of their experience. So not only do we allow them to lead us as a form of repairing relationships, but we restore trust by giving them the resources that they need to be able to do this work. And resources doesn't just mean training, because so often we're like, we need to give people training. No, sometimes we need to give people material resources. We need to make sure they are fed, they are clothed. We need to make sure they have water, first and foremost. This is something I take from like the Black Panther Party and the work they did with local communities. They made sure their material needs were met first and foremost. And that should be sort of something that inspires the work we do as sort of committed anti-racists. We then lastly need to reaffirm our commitments in challenging structures of Western dominance and hegemony. Very often we ask ourselves, what can we do to make sure the situation in the global south is better? And very often the first response is to take a gap year, to go there, to work on the ground with local people. This sort of volunteerism that has sort of become almost an infection of gap year students, often going and creating sometimes more crisis than is necessary. We need to literally give people what they materially need. We don't always need to be there to do that. We can often do the best work for challenging global inequality, for challenging poverty, for challenging neocolonialism by holding our own governments, by holding our own organizations feet to the fire, by doing that here, by keeping the pressure here, by letting them know that we are constantly at watch, that we're constantly wanting to challenge how they're engaging with the global south. That is something we can do here. And that's something that I think we need to do more of. Instead of viewing the work of sort of the global aid in the global south as something that should be like a tourist mission, we have to shift the conditions in the global north. We have to demand more. We have to demand that everyone live more accordingly to values of equality, to values of equity, and for organizations to make a sort of stance in not continuing these systems of extractive labor, of exploitation of the global south. I think those are fundamentally important, the sort of 4 R's that I want everyone to sort of take with them from this session. I hope we found this all helpful, and I hope I haven't sort of been too complex. And like I said, I'm sort of still battling COVID, so I'm sort of powering through this. And I had a few blank moments, but hopefully everyone enjoyed that and found that useful. And thank you so much, as always, for letting me sort of speak to you for a while about something I'm so passionate about. And I know I've taken up so much of your time. So I'm going to end this here. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the conference and some other sort of conversations, especially what's coming up next in specifically thinking through joy as an act of resistance. So thank you all so much.